Okay. Kind introduction. Yeah. So on book, I don't have it, but I think with Joan, book a prime, but include the and my hope that reflect on the COVID project. This is before the vaccine. I thought, this thing finished before I go. So so I started working on other, and I had and sent it in Sunday. I was in around 11 o'clock in the morning. I was sitting on the couch, and I hadn't even been able to get off the couch. By 1 o'clock, I had a response from the Walter Bogoya, editor of Wicken and he was saying he read 20 pages and it was a go. So if you ever want to publish with them, I see the same outcome, but anyway, the book was accepted by the so who is Joan Wicken? I'm sure a lot of you are wondering why I'm talking to you. Most of my work, as many of you know, has been mostly on African women, but in this case, it's about a British. She was the personal assistant and speechwriter to Nyerere and worked with him for over 45 years. And I went and I've done interviews over the years, but went then the last one to Aili in England, where she retired 4 years. Asked her about her association with Nyerere because he had just died at the time, and thought, there's nobody else that knew him as well personally, but also as a bishop. Wanted to talk to her, get her insights. She did a lot. She was basically his alter ego. Tanzania's first Attorney General, Roland Brown, called Joan Wicken the mirror of Julius Nyerere's mind. Professor Cranford Pratt, who was the first principal of Islam, described her as the power behind the throne. Was one of the authors of this wonderful 3-volume biography of Nyerere that came out of with Sashivji, and this came out in 2020. She said that Wicken was a constant shadow of Nyerere, and shadow sometimes leading the subject. Interview then provides talks about her relationship with Nyerere, into her life, and very intensely. Very strong views. But it tells us about Nyerere, about how he experienced the key moments in Tanzania's political history, but of course through her eyes. And talks about, maybe before I get going, I just will play a little clip just so that you also get a sense of him. He comes through quite nicely in the interviews, but it's also nice to see. Maybe I need your help here. And L, and I don't use L's. Okay, just just 1 minute here. And
sometimes I don't get annoyed. Yeah, I am.
And he's talking about how
former president of my country, no problem in Tanzania. We've never had these problems that they have. But I'm an African, and they see me, and they ask me the problems of Rwanda. I said, but I don't come from Rwanda. But you come from Africa. But I don't meet everybody. I don't meet an Englishman somewhere. Huh? If Blair was to come to Dar es Salaam, I don't ask him what is happening in Bosnia. It never occurs to me. I should ask Blair, what is happening to you Europeans because of what is happening in if President Cole was to come somewhere, I don't ask him what is happening in Chechnya. Well, Cole could say, why are you asking me anything about Chechnya? I don't know what is happening in Chechnya. But this is not true about Africa. About Africa, Mr. President, you go, here you are, trying to build something which is a tremendous experience. But perhaps you are different because sometimes they think South Africa is different. So perhaps they would say, but this is President Mandela, this is different, it's not... But for the likes of me, no, I'm an African. And I say something.
Adam, who is your picture here on the left, and in the middle is Maria Nyerere, the wife. She looked forward. She worked very closely with Wicken. She would have kept drafts that she would write of the speeches. Up in Tanzania, 1960 to 1974. I was the daughter of my from Finland, but she came originally to Tanganyika then, 1952, as a teacher, and then later taught at the University of Dar es Salaam. My father did work with, pictured there, my mother, he did work with, he was a pastor, worked with the Lutheran World Federation, and it was worked quite closely with SWAPO, the Namibians who were in exile at the time in Dar es Salaam, and he also so, I went back to do field work for my dissertation at Northwestern, formally me. Okay, enough about me. I did, but that explains also why I knew child. I mean, since 1960, we knew. So, instead of on the outskirts of London, she was raised by her father, who was a worker and a trade unionist. Her mother was ill during her formative years, and she died when Joan was 7. So Joan was raised by her aunt and her father. And she was very strongly influenced by his identification with the Labour Party. That explains why she went on to work with the Labour Party. She finished secondary school at 15 and then worked for a while as a clerk garage, and where she learned shorthand typing and bookkeeping, which came in very much handy later on. She filled 2 the territorial service. This was typical Joan. She was very honest about everything, positives and negatives. All. So Nyerere met when she was at the of Labour, and he invited her. She then to Kenya to the Federation of Rhodesia and from the Somerville College at Oxford University she had attended. Nyerere at the time was the chairman of the Tanganyika African National Union, TANU, and so Wicken was very drawn to him from the outset. She saw him as a philosopher, as would relate to ordinary people who really operate at many different levels. At the time, he was touring Tanganyika and making the case for independence, a 600-mile trip around the country. And she found Tanganyika to be by far the most interesting countries that she visited, and these experiences on her. In the report, she described Nyerere as an extremely modest person who was often embarrassed by his popularity among ordinary people. She was there at a time when they had banned public speaking, but she nevertheless went ahead with his trip. And so she witnessed him giving speeches to members of TANU in particular, and she report captures enthusiasm with which people embraced Nyerere, and of course, independence that he represented. He found this same enthusiasm, but also areas. He talks about you. A mile away from our destination, we were met by a crowd of people running down the road towards us, waving green branches which they had torn from the roadside trees. They then insisted on pushing the car for the rest of the way, singing triumphal chants as they did so. Just about every person of the village was gathered at the central square of life there. So later then, Wicken, shortly actually, she returned to Tanganyika in 1960, year of independence, and she toured the country to raise funds from ordinary citizens of the college. And many of the who attended this college at their beginnings. So in 1960, she then started working as a speechwriter and personal assistant to initially civil service in 1960. So this is the transition period from British rule to independence. So she was hired by the civil service of Britain to help Nyerere prepare for independence. She also had to write the inaugural independence speech. She drafted Nyerere's policy statements and speeches, primarily the ones that were given in English. Sometimes after the from the Middle East, had on the formulation of some of the ideas of Nyerere. Oh, she denied influencing Tanzanian politics. She certainly had a hand in articulating it as part of the State House team. She remained with Nyerere throughout, from his time as chief minister to prime minister to president. And he continued, he was also at the same time chair of the Tanganyika African National Union, TANU. And then with the merger with Zanzibar, it became Chama Cha Mapinduzi, the same party, but a different name. And then she continued even after he stepped down as president in 1985. She continued with him as a chair of the party. And then he formed a non-aligned South Commission, which then she participated in, helped set up, and also was helped set up the Nyerere Foundation, which exists to this day. And this is the State House where she worked. Also knew very well who was the Swahili speechwriter. He was my parents were parents to one of his daughters, and I've also interviewed him. Like I said, had a press secretary and less. So, you comments about Wicken as a person, just because it's interesting, and you get a sense of her. I did visit her from time to time. She lived not far from us in Kurasini, on the outskirts of Dar es Salaam, and she lived in the Salvation Army compound. She had a Vespa scooter, and then later acquired a small white Fiat, which she drove around Dar es Salaam. And she lived in a tiny white cottage the thatched roof and a bougainvillea kind of creeping up the walls. She would sometimes on Saturday afternoon entertain people for tea. I remember seeing piles of books all over the small one-room apartment or house that she lived in. She smoked a lot. She had enjoyed a little bit of whiskey, which was perhaps her only indulgence, given the frugal woman that she was. But she was extremely humble in not seeking any special privileges or accommodations, and she regarded this as a point of pride. Wicken had been offered a larger house and pleasant gardens, but she turned it down, preferring to remain in her small, modest residence. She didn't wear makeup, she dressed with clothes she sewed herself. She baked her own bread and she made her sandwiches for the whole week in advance. I don't know if that's a good idea, but she did that. She never put on airs and were expected to be treated differently than most ordinary Tanzanians. She shunned the lavish displays of wealth and the ministers and fancy cars because she felt it set a bad example for ordinary people. When she retired, she refused to accept a resettlement compensation of £50,000 to offset the expense of moving to the UK. She retired then in Aili, and somehow, I don't know why, but I'm just not surprised to have learned that this was voted one of the top 10 worst places to live in England. It just somehow fit. It's not like she didn't have a choice, but she chose. And even there, she maintained this modest lifestyle and very sparse belongings. This is long before the minimalism trend that we have. She adhered to a strict work ethic and a code of conduct while at the State House, according to Anna Mwansasu. According to Anna, who I'm in touch with quite a bit, actually, she was very close to Wicken, and she didn't tolerate office gossip, tardiness, laziness, and unnecessary talk on the phone. But she had a good sense of humor and was social. She even gave up her travel allowances to be shared equally among the staff workers. The people, who was the head of the Nyerere Foundation, was also a good friend of hers and went to see her in England before she died. And he noted that she would work, when she was working with the president, she would work past midnight most nights, even though she started work at 9 a.m. and spent late afternoons in Nyerere's home in Sasani, talking to the president from 5 to 6 p.m., thus discussing the day's events and planning the next schedule. She also traveled a lot with him, and at the end with the South Mission, she went to 31 countries. I mean, they traveled a lot. And even though she was this simple, I don't think just to show. I mean, she was a frugal person. One of the things that I had a hard time reconciling was that I kind of appreciation of how some of Nyerere's policies had hurt ordinary people and them into everyday acts of economic duplicity. And I just found that, and even was her insistence that people had to apply some of the challenging activities they were already living in the streets. But this is where we perhaps felt that hardships were primarily a product of global imposed measures. And for me, I really agree with that. Part of the problem. There were also distortions that had created policies. Crops over so on. So we just those were differences we had. Okay, so she, as you can imagine, she had many berries. Even up in Tanzania, because the government's won't get primary school, and it's great. And I saw Nasser, Haile Selassie, Kaunda, Kenyatta, the whole first generation of founding fathers of Africa. She was very impressed. Who really impressed you the most? Joan was one. Olaf Palme was another. He had been very instrumental in providing money for Tanzania's education, universal primary education. They launched. Somehow she's found hard to reconcile. She said that he had many aspects. He was very smart, but she just couldn't get over the fact that he was a murderer. And quote, this one murdering, or even of power, but he was committed 100% to the unity of Ethiopia, and so that because of those, anyway, this is what confused her, or that she found hard to reconcile because this issue of unity was so important to her, and of course to him. Yahya Othman, at one of those volumes, 3-part volume I mentioned, trilogy, notes that the long hours that she spent with Nyerere upset his wife, Maria Nyerere, from time to time. And Maria's frustration may have come from the fact that he didn't treat his wife as an intellectual equal like he did Wicken, no doubt leading to tensions. It's unlikely that she suspected a romantic affair between the two of them, even though there were such rumors swirling around. But when I interviewed Wicken, she stayed clear of talking about these tensions in the interview and spoke only in positive terms about Maria Nyerere. And she also appreciated her important role in single-handedly raising the family with little support from Nyerere. They had 8 children. Unlike most first ladies, Maria Nyerere was not afforded any special privileges, nor were his children. Nyerere did not allow people to refer to her as a first lady, but rather as Mrs. Nyerere. As Wicken admired Nyerere, they never had a romantic relationship. I'll just put it out there because I know some people, wondered if she was like the European wife or something. It was a professional relationship that was based on political affinity and friendship, even though there was always, like I said, speculation in Tanzania. The love of her life actually was Kenyan Tamamboya, who she had met in England when he was studying industrial management, but after she did. Nyerere knew about that relationship and sympathized. They weren't able to then, continue it for political reasons. He married a Kenyan, but it was kind of an impossible relationship since she was working for Nyerere, and he was a very prominent independence activist. As you know, Kenya got independence in '64. He also then had positions as Minister of Justice and Constitutional Affairs, and several other ministerial posts. He was then assassinated, sadly, at the age of 38. It was no doubt a political assassination, but it was, yeah. So what comes through in the interview is Wicken's intelligence and her self-awareness, her self-confident, or through her confident assertions, self-deprecating humor. Fully herself and very British, at the same time, kind of at one with Nyerere's goals for Tanzania as an individual who was entrenched in the political of Islam. It's clear they had many running jokes. Wicken herself was a woman of convictions. This is something I just had a really hard time getting my head around. She was very opinionated and self-assured in her beliefs, such as in her unwavering support for socialism. Had a strong and yet, on the other hand, she was completely submerged. She completely submerged her own need for recognition behind Nyerere's agenda. No doubt this was partly a function of her role as a speechwriter, but also of the fact that she was not a Tanzanian, something of which she was acutely cognizant. And there were lines that she would not cross. She was extremely sensitive to her positionality as an outsider. And at one point she says, I used to get horrified at the way some that they had all the answers. I didn't ever feel that, but I would argue from my own background. End quote. I have no doubt that she spoke freely with Nyerere, although while maintaining, and as a result, she made a. Lois was saying, "Why haven't her?" This is she did. I mean, she kept a low profile on purpose. Didn't anything at all. When I asked what was your contribution, and she said, "This made Mwalimu's job a little easier on the margin to him more than anything else." For those of you who don't know, Mwalimu is the term for teacher, and this is how Nyerere was referred to in Tanzania. clearly had an impact. You, all those speeches don't have some influence. I mean, there's, I don't think coincidence that one finds her always kind of tucked away. This is how you'll see her in pictures, but she's always tucked in the back. Very rarely is she in the foreground. It's with the Queen of England. And then they took the picture and used it for the book. This wasn't my choice, but I mean, but it's fine because they cut the Queen of England out. So this must be the first time that the Queen of England got cut out of a picture. Oh, but yeah, no doubt that she had a substantial on Nyerere's thinking, and his speeches and were really a product of their intellectual collaboration or banter or whatever you want to call it. She made many self-deprecating comments in the interview, downplaying her own importance, from references to her failures in learning French and math as a student, to her deficiencies in economics that came into full view in a public debate in England when she was working for the Labour Party. She talks about how she was a difficult daughter to her father and how she was terrible for a secretary for the Africa Education Trust. I don't know anybody like that. I mean, but she didn't. It was just. But these were just facts for her. They weren't. She didn't. It didn't come from any, lack of self-confidence or anything like that. Although Wicken was obviously more than an assistant, it's curious to note that numerous African presidents of that first generation had British assistants or secretaries, so she wasn't the only one. In fact, Nyerere's secretary was Mrs. Wilson, a woman that he had met in Edinburgh when he was studying, and she had been a mother to him when he was a student abroad. President of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, also had a British private secretary, Erica Powell, who then went on to work for Siaka Stevens, the president of Sierra Leone. So although close presidential relationships with foreigners might have been unthreatening, there's always the possibility that outsiders might be surreptitiously for external interests. Yahya Othman cites concerns that Wicken might have been used by the British to ease Nyerere's ties with the Soviet Union. This is highly unlikely, given her allegiance to Nyerere and to non-alignment. If anything, Nyerere used her to interpret British and American objectives. He seemed to believe that her reporting on foreign diplomats to him was a way of ensuring that he knew what she was up to and that she was not compromised in any way. And then also, this is a side story, but this is just again so Joan. She said she once got mad at the British High Commissioner for calling her Joan. And she said to him, "Would you please stop calling me Joan? My name is Miss Wicken." Anyway, but to understand Wicken, you have to understand Nyerere and vice versa. And Yahya Othman astutely notes that in her personal correspondence, she often used collective we to refer to her, Nyerere, and the Tanzanian government combined. And I noticed the same pattern in the interview with her as well. For some of the time she was talking about her and Nyerere as we, but other times she was clearly referring to the country or the government, Tanzania as well. Her identity was so intertwined with these, with the country and with Nyerere. So when I asked her about some of the failures, this is in 94, because I interviewed her sometimes in 1994 as well, and I asked her about some of the failures of the overreach of the state in economic development, and she responded, "Look, we didn't know anymore. We didn't know any more than anyone else about what we were doing. Nobody did. We just what would seem right at the time. We did the best we could," end quote. And she also felt, again, that the donors should have taken more of the blame, and she really abhorred donor arrogance. I also asked her, lots of questions. I'd like to go and look at the book. I can't get into everything, but like I asked her, what did he regret? What did Nyerere regret? Was there anything he regretted? And she said that the main regret was the remorse over the environment, that Nyerere, he hadn't done enough. We did not understand the effects at the time. Now he's trying to rectify this through the South Commission, or this is 94 again. Here again, this, you hear this triad of the we that Yahya Othman describes. Much of her personality comes through in her comments about what she valued in Nyerere, and she respected him above all for his concern for the general welfare of the people, his egalitarianism, and his desire to uplift the poor. Sharp income differentials that deeply disturbed her as Nyerere. In the interview, Nyerere also talks about how he fought against tribalism, and not only of course, but and he was particularly otherwise tribalism after President Ali Hassan when you took. Especially taken by Nyerere's simplicity, which of course was her own hallmark. And in her eulogy to him, when he died, she notes that he was particularly irritated when his vehicle drove out of the State House and soldiers would blow a bugle and force the traffic off the road, and felt that this was due to the growing insistence for the presentation. I was worried that he was fast becoming the worst public nuisance in the city of Dar es Salaam has ever had to put up with. When he first became president, Nyerere was given the residence of the previous governor general in the State House. Believing it was too grandiose, he the security people built a fence around his home, which he was unhappy about. In fact, when he visited us a few times and he would come, he had two unarmed guys with him. That's it. That was the extent of the security. Anyway, he eventually told the government to take over the mortgage and keep the house as government property. And then he built another 4-room home in Butiama in northern Tanzania for his wife when he retired, and that's where he ended up retiring. But he used to go there for Christmas. Wicken appreciated that he was a good listener. He listened to people regardless of their position in society, and he listened attentively even to people who he disagreed with, but he arrived at his own judgments and decisions and took responsibility for his own decisions. She found him to be well organized and considerate. He was punctual and he didn't complain much. I watched a whole ton of videos. I don't know why I got one of those rabbit holes, but it was a fun one. Watching Nyerere videos, and you see that liveliness in pretty much every speech, even very serious ones. But she says, quote, if you really felt depressed and you had a chance to talk to Mwalimu, you always came back more cheerful. This was not because he thought things were easy. He didn't, or because he took the easy way out of difficult decisions. She also made the point that, quote, he would say that you are not defeated on anything until you've given up. And that's the worst sin. The worst sin is despair. The only unforgivable sin, he once told me, is despair. And he took that stance on the unity of Africa and the development of the South and the unity and cooperation of countries of the South. And so she loved, the way that he made people laugh, and when he gave, especially in Swahili at mass rallies, he persuaded people with laughter. The only time she saw him angry was when the dignity of Tanzania or the dignity of individuals was questioned. Just like my sense when he visited our homes several times, he was always very, kind of lighthearted, and that was something that she really, very easy to smile and laugh, and she found that also appealing about him. I asked what he was most proud of in terms of accomplishments, and she said that he was most proud of the peace and unity Tanzania had enjoyed since independence. And of course, you only have to look at the countries surrounding Tanzania to know what that means. That's not a light statement. Tanzania didn't have the same challenges that other countries faced in terms of conflict. There were some skirmishes with Uganda during Idi Amin's time, but basically, it was a peaceful country, and it still is. And he was proud of the fact that he believed people felt that the government was on their side during his presidency. He was also especially pleased with his role in the non-aligned movement and in helping liberate Southern Africa. As you may know, there were a lot of the liberation movements had their base in Tanzania for a long time. In fact, every night I went to sleep, I prayed for the liberation of Namibia because of my father's connection with the Namibian liberation movement. When I asked about his main regrets, and I guess that's what this picture comes in, she said that he bitterly regretted sending 3 men to Zanzibar for questioning after the Zanzibar, and 2 were killed in an extrajudicial manner, and this upset him deeply. Which again tells you something about so he worked. The other kind of regret was the difficulty in forming the East African Federation. I mean, there wasn't an East African Community was formed, but he wanted to actually merge all the countries, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanganyika. That never happened, and that was much to his that was a regret. But nevertheless, he was able to forge a union with Zanzibar in 1964. And Wicken talks about how sacred this union was to him. And even after he stepped down as president, the union was one of the 3 things that he spoke about openly, even though he tried not to interfere too much in the presidency of his successor, Ali Hassan Mwinyi. But his main concerns really, after he stepped down, had to do with the future of Zanzibar and its relationship with the mainland, the corruption of the country's leaders, and the country losing its sovereignty to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The other regret that he had was having been forced. He really had no choice. But in '64 there was a mutiny. Actually, they were in all these countries, and Tanzania was one of them. And so, it was over the pay that the military, the pay that was being given to the soldiers, and the fact that they still had British leadership in the military, and they were paid more. And so he then had to call in the British troops to suppress this mutiny, and it pained him to a great extent. And it was really the most painful moment for him in the history of Tanzania, was having to call. He felt embarrassed and that he had to resort to bringing in the British troops. But it was the only last resort, and it was clear there was no other option. But this was also the scariest time for him, and he had to go into hiding for a few days, and she also had to lay low for some time with Mrs. She had to take Mrs. Wilson and go into hiding. I asked her about some of the differences that she had. Getting here. So one of them had to do with the treatment of Bibi Titi, who was very prominent nationalist leader in Tanganyika, Tanzania. She became the head of the Umoja wa Wanawake, which was the main women's union. But she was really he was a good orator, but she was a better orator than him even. And she only had a 3rd grade education. But she went around with him, and she could really speak to people, and she really galvanized people especially along the coastal areas. She galvanized women, got them to get TANU membership cards. But after independence, she got, I'll say what Wicken said about her. There were purges that went on with some of the leaders that were accused of plotting to overthrow Nyerere, and some of these accusations landed Bibi Titi in prison in 1970. The repression of these high-profile cases had the effect of silencing opposition for years to come. Quote for Wicken, "That woman was being used and exploited like nobody's business. She was innocent in the strongest sense of the word. She did not realize what was happening. She did not realize how she was being exploited. She really did feel that this was her chance." I mean, it was some kind of business deal that she was getting into. I'm not, anyway. It's too detailed to get into the minutia of it, but just that, she was accused and she was rehabilitated later on. Anyway, Bibi Titi felt that now we are independent, we have Africans in charge, and I'm one of them. And so, she was uneducated, and she was taken advantage of and ended up, way over her head in some kind of a deal that landed her in jail for some time. But then she was later on rehabilitated, and they've named a street after her, and she's kind of back in, then she died some years ago. closing of an organic collective farm initiative, the Ruvuma Development Association, which was kind of a grassroots socialist enterprise. And somehow the party leaders felt that it was somehow challenging them. And so accepted. We also had some cases around women's rights. When I asked her about her close associates, he named a few people. One that was perhaps the longest standing associate was this Amir Jamal. This is when they had won the elections in '58. This is before independence. As you may know or may not, there was a European seat, Asian seat, and an African seat for every constituency in this '58 election. That changed after independence. But anyway, he was then Minister of Finance and had many other ministerial positions. He was born in Kwanzaa in Tanganyika, and his family was of Gujarat origin, but very staunch supporter of TANU and CCM and of Nyerere, and they were very, very good friends and kinds of social. The South Commission that formed in '87. You see Joan Wicken here in the background, and Jamal is also here somewhere. I can't see him now, but anyway, he was in Nyerere there. And if I look enough, I'll find Jamal, but I know he's in it. Then she moved to Keighley, England, and continued to work for the South Commission, then later on the South Centre, and continued to write speeches for Nyerere. She was also writing up her notes when I visited her, which were about her. She'd written everything that she learned in shorthand. She'd written them in shorthand, was typing them up, and they were put in the Baudelaire archives. So if anybody, they'll be released in about 10 years. So if you're thinking of a topic, maybe it's too late for dissertation, but further down the road, her notes are there, and I can imagine she took copious notes. This is at Oxford University. She took up drawing and painting in her last years and gave talks on her work and life to like Oxfam. She was a staunch atheist, but she joined a Quaker group, and but her hip and her guilty when she stopped working at and but basically it was death in 1999 that brought an end to their lifelong and she herself died 6 weeks in 2004 at the age of 79 up there in Chile, the worst town in Britain. And she didn't want a religious ceremony, but they did end the ceremony with the playing of the upbeat New Orleans jazz piece, Anna Armstrong. So there you have it.